Senior Chief Isaiah Bennett lay face down on the polished floor of Cumberland International Airport, one cheek pressed flat against the cold tile. His navy dress blues, pressed and precise only an hour earlier, were now twisted across his shoulders. Officer Richard Vale's knee pressed into his upper back. Officer Luke Danner gripped his wrists, working to pull them together behind him. Travelers had stopped moving in every direction around them, in the wide public concourse just past the security checkpoint, well inside airport police territory, rather than anywhere TSA would ever have reason to intervene. Phones rose into the air, one after another, screens glowing, all of them aimed at the man on the floor. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable?" Vale said, his voice carrying across the concourse. "Senior Chief Isaiah Bennett," Isaiah said, each word deliberate and clear. "United States Navy, active duty. I am not resisting." "Stop moving," Vale ordered. Isaiah wasn't moving at all. He lay perfectly still, his hands open, his voice steady. "I have identification. I have travel orders. Check them." Vale didn't answer him. He pressed down harder instead. Isaiah was 42 years old. A black man and a senior chief petty officer with naval special warfare. 17 years of service behind him, and multiple deployments he never spoke about, outside the people who'd earned the right to hear it. He had learned a long time ago that stillness could be its own kind of armor, and right now, on this floor, it was the only armor he had. Within roughly 12 minutes, word of what was happening to him would already be moving up a chain that had nothing to do with airport policy. A chain that ran through his command duty officer and into channels these two officers had no idea existed. They didn't know that yet. Right now, to them this was just a stop that had gotten out of hand. A story they still believed they controlled. 15 minutes earlier, none of this had been true. The terminal had been quiet in the particular way. Early mornings always were. Rolling suitcases clattering over tile seams. A boarding announcement echoing somewhere near Gate 14. The smell of coffee drifting from a kiosk that had only just opened. Families moved in loose clusters. Airline staff pushed carts of folded blankets. Isaiah walked through the public concourse in his dress blues, a garment bag over one shoulder and a carry-on rolling behind him, his bearing upright out of habit rather than performance. He had spent the previous evening at a memorial service for a teammate he'd lost years earlier, a service that ended with a folded program now resting inside his garment bag, and he was moving directly from that service toward an official command briefing, the uniform required for both. Two other uniformed service members, both younger, both white, both traveling together and talking easily with each other, had passed through that same concourse only minutes earlier without a single officer so much as glancing their way. Isaiah was walking alone, and there was a kind of quiet self-possession in the way he carried himself that some people read as confidence and others, apparently, read as something to be challenged. Vale's eyes settled on him and didn't move. "Hey, hold up a second." Isaiah stopped and turned toward him, calm and direct. "Morning, officer. Those bags yours?" "Yes, sir. Set them down." Isaiah lowered the garment bag carefully and let go of the carry-on handle, still well within the range of an ordinary, voluntary conversation, the kind officers had with travelers dozens of times a day. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed?" "Coming from a memorial service last night. Headed to a command briefing this morning." Vale's expression didn't shift. "I'm going to need to see your military orders. I have my ID and my travel orders both. They're in my inside jacket pocket." Isaiah's hand began to move slowly toward it. "Hands where I can see them," Vale said sharply. Isaiah stopped immediately, both palms open at his sides. "Understood. Not reaching for anything. Just let me know when you want me to retrieve them." Danner stepped in beside his partner, positioning himself to block Isaiah's path forward. "We've had reports about people using military uniforms to move through places they shouldn't," Vale said. There was no current bulletin behind that sentence, nothing specific to Isaiah at all. Only a months-old general awareness, notice about impersonation that Vale had, without quite admitting it to himself, reshaped into a personal justification the moment he needed one. What's the specific description I'm supposed to match? Isaiah asked. Vale didn't answer the question directly. You're getting awfully argumentative for someone who says he's got nothing to hide. I'm asking what I matched. That's a fair question. Vale looked him over, his eyes moving across the ribbons on Isaiah's chest, the rank insignia on his collar. Anybody can buy this stuff online, doesn't mean anything. I can give you my rank and my branch right now, plain and simple. Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. You don't look like a senior chief to me. What's a senior chief supposed to look like? Vale's jaw tightened at the question as though being asked to explain himself was its own kind of insult. Am I being detained? Isaiah asked. This was the question that mattered most, the exact line between a voluntary conversation and something else entirely, and the way Vale answered it would define everything that followed. I'll decide that. I'm asking why I was stopped in the first place. There it is, Vale said, glancing at Danner. That attitude right there. It wasn't an attitude. It was a question, asked plainly, the same question anyone had the right to ask. But Vale had already decided what kind of encounter this was going to be, long before Isaiah said a word that could have justified it. And the moment Danner moved to block his path, whatever had started as a consensual stop had become a detention, with nothing objective behind it at all. Turn around, Vale said. Isaiah turned, slow and deliberate, placing his open hands behind his back on his own. I am not resisting, he said again. I want that on the record. Vale grabbed his right wrist and pulled it upward. Danner took the left. Careful with this one, Vale muttered to his partner. Guys like this can turn in a second. That assumption is wrong, Isaiah said, his voice still level. Something about being corrected seemed to strike a nerve in Vale that his own suspicion hadn't. Down, Vale said, and before Isaiah had a chance to lower himself, Vale shoved him forward. Danner pulled the other arm at the same time. Isaiah's knees hit the tile first, then his shoulder, then the side of his face, the fabric of his dress blues, scraping hard against the polished floor. A woman near the coffee kiosk gasped and pulled her daughter back by the shoulder. Vale drove his knee into Isaiah's upper back. I'm not moving, Isaiah said, his cheek against the tile. You're hurting me. The cuffs closed around his wrists, one click and then the other. A man in his 60s, wearing a faded Navy veteran's cap, stepped closer to the scene. That uniform's real, he said, and that man didn't fight you at all. I watched the whole thing. Back up, sir, Vale said without looking at him. The man, Frank Dalton, didn't back up completely, but he didn't push further either, and his phone stayed raised. Recording. A few feet away, a mother named Maya Richards held her own phone steady, her daughter's hand gripped tightly in her free one. Her recording had caught the moment just before the takedown, Isaiah's voice clear on the audio. I am complying. Isaiah understood exactly what these recordings meant, and he made sure over and over to give them something true to capture. I am complying, he repeated now, loud enough for the cameras to catch it clearly. I have valid identification. I am active duty. I am not resisting. Vale and Danner lifted him to his feet. You're being detained for disorderly conduct, failure to comply, and possible impersonation of a service member, Vale said. I complied with every instruction you gave me, Isaiah said. Every single one. We'll sort it out inside. Before they could move him toward the police office, a woman in uniform crossed the concourse at a brisk pace, badge catching the overhead light. Sergeant Maria Sloan stopped in front of the scene and took in the situation with a single sweeping glance. The crowd, the phones, the man in dress, blues, and handcuffs. What happened here? Possible impersonation, Vale said. Got aggressive when I tried to verify. I am active duty Navy, Isaiah said. I have identification and orders on my person. I did not resist at any point. Where are his documents? Maria asked. Vale hesitated before reaching into Isaiah's jacket pocket himself and producing the wallet and a folded set of orders. Maria opened the wallet first. The photograph matched. The name matched. The rank matched. She unfolded the orders next, scanning the destination and the issuing command, then radioed airport operations and asked them to call the duty number printed directly on the orders. and to route it through the Federal Liaison Desk, the airport kept on file for exactly this kind of verification. The callback came in a few minutes later, confirming Isaiah's status, his command, and the legitimacy of his travel exactly as the paperwork claimed. "Why is he still in cuffs?" Maria asked, turning to Vale. He was evasive, had an attitude about it. "Every witness I can see right now says he answered every question you asked him," Maria said. "Take the pressure off him and get those cuffs removed. The documents could still be fake," Vale said. "They've already been verified. We're done with that argument." The cuffs came off a moment later, and Isaiah rolled his shoulders slowly, wincing as feeling returned to his wrists. Red marks circled both of them. His cheek throbbed where it had struck the tile, and a deep ache had already settled into his shoulder and lower back. "Do you need medical attention?" Maria asked. "I want all of it documented," Isaiah said. "The wrists, the face, the shoulder, the back. All of it on the record." An airport medic arrived within minutes to photograph the marks and assess him before he was cleared to continue. "He's making a scene," Vale said. "The scene started," Isaiah said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since the cuffs went on. "The moment you decided I didn't belong in this uniform." Maria ordered both officers to step away from the immediate area, then called her chief directly, laying out the facts in the plain, unembellished language of someone who understood exactly how much those facts mattered. A force incident, an active duty Navy senior chief, verified military identification, multiple civilian witnesses, body camera footage from both officers, possible biased language during the encounter. Chief Harold Mercer arrived within the half hour and moved through short, direct conversations with Maria, with Isaiah, with Vale, with Danner, and with two of the witnesses still on scene. "You said he matched an impersonation profile," Mercer said to Vale. "Show me the alert, the bulletin, anything specific." Vale didn't have one. There wasn't a formal alert. It was more of an instinct based on experience. "An instinct isn't a legal basis for a takedown," Mercer said. He pulled both officers from public duty on the spot, ordered their weapons, radios, and airport credentials surrendered pending review, and directed that every piece of footage in the building, body camera and surveillance both, be preserved and locked before end of shift. He assigned officers to collect contact information from every witness still present and to request copies of any civilian phone video. He activated internal affairs before Isaiah had even finished giving his statement. By the time the medic finished, the statement was taken, and Isaiah's original connecting flight had already departed without him. Airline staff rebooked him onto a later flight, and his command adjusted the timing of the briefing to accommodate it. A small, unglamorous cost that nonetheless was real. Roughly 12 minutes after the cuffs first closed around Isaiah's wrists, though well before any of that rebooking happened, the notification had already left the airport entirely, moving through the airport's federal liaison to Isaiah's command duty officer, then toward Naval Special Warfare's legal office, then NCIS, then Department of Defense legal channels. No one at the Pentagon picked up a phone and fired anyone in that window. That wasn't how any of this worked, and Isaiah knew it better than almost anyone in that terminal. What those 12 minutes meant was simpler and, in its own way, more permanent. The version of events Vale had wanted to write, the one where a difficult, aggressive man had been lawfully subdued, no longer belonged only to him. It now existed inside an evidence chain that stretched far past his department, past his chief, past anything he could quietly reshape later in a report. Within the following days, an evidence technician uploaded and locked both officers' body camera files, along with airport surveillance recordings, the witness videos submitted by Frank Dalton and Maya Richards, radio transmissions from the encounter, and every draft of the incident report either officer had begun. The footage told a story with no ambiguity in it at all. Isaiah answering every question Vale asked him. Isaiah's hand staying visible throughout, even as he explained where his identification was. Vale, when directly asked, unable to name a specific reason for his suspicion. Vale's own words, captured clearly by his microphone. "You don't look like a senior chief to me." Isaiah turning around on his own, without resistance, exactly as instructed. Isaiah's voice, calm and repeated, saying he was not resisting, in the seconds immediately before Vale pushed him to the ground. Danner's hand on the other arm, pulling in the same motion. Continued pressure against Isaiah's back, even after the cuffs were already secured. Investigators laid Vale's written account beside the footage, line by line, and the gap between the two was not subtle. Vale had written that Isaiah lunged forward and attempted to pull away. The video showed no lunge, no pull, nothing but a man lying still with his cheek against the tile. NCIS Special Agent Karen Foster met with Isaiah 2 days later to take his formal statement, confirming his duty status, his travel orders, his destination that morning, and documenting his injuries alongside the marks already visible on his wrists. "Why did you stay so still through all of it?" she asked him. "Because I knew the second I moved, even to protect myself, it would be written down as resistance," Isaiah said. "Staying still was the only thing I had control over." In the weeks that followed, a Department of Justice civil rights team opened its own review, focused narrowly on whether Vale and Danner had deprived Isaiah of his rights while acting under the authority of their badges. Each agency involved had a distinct job. Internal Affairs reviewed policy and use of force violations. The State Certification Board reviewed whether Vale and Danner should keep their badges at all. The Department of Justice examined the incident through the lens of civil rights. NCIS and Navy legal staff handled the military side and supported Isaiah through his own command. The Department of Defense simply monitored the process through legal channels, without inserting itself into decisions that belonged to civilian authorities. When investigators sat Vale down for his formal interview, they asked him plainly to describe the profile Isaiah had supposedly matched. "He was argumentative," Vale said, "questioning me at every step." "That's not a profile," the investigator said. "What specifically made you suspect impersonation?" "He didn't look right in the uniform." "What specifically was incorrect about the uniform?" Vale had no answer for that either. Danner's interview went differently. He admitted that Isaiah had complied with the order to turn around, that he'd heard Isaiah say clearly that he wasn't resisting, and that no impersonation alert or bulletin had ever justified the stop. He also admitted that his own written report had echoed Vale's account of a struggle he now acknowledged, on review of the footage, had never happened. "Why did you go along with it?" the investigator asked him. "Vale's senior to me. I followed his lead," Danner said. "Every officer wearing that badge has an independent duty to prevent unlawful force," the investigator said. "Following someone's lead isn't a defense for standing by while it happens, and it isn't a defense for what you wrote afterward either." As the investigation widened, a clearer picture of Vale's history began to surface. Internal Affairs pulled his full complaint file for the first time as a single collection, rather than case by case, and a pattern that had been invisible one file at a time became unmistakable once it was laid out together. Several complaints involved black travelers stopped without any clear justification, people who had questioned why they'd been detained and were then described afterward as aggressive. There were complaints about unnecessary restraint, and about Vale's habit of citing a vague behavioral profile that never seemed to match any actual bulletin. More than one complaint referenced comments Vale had made about whether someone looked like they belonged somewhere, in a certain uniform, in a certain part of the terminal. Previous supervisors had closed those cases individually, one at a time, as simple communication breakdowns, never comparing them against each other, never noticing that the same officer's name kept appearing beside the same kind of language. One junior officer had quietly requested reassignment years earlier, specifically because of how often Vale escalated encounters that hadn't needed to escalate at all, a request one supervisor had approved without asking why. Another complaint on file involved a black airport employee, stopped and questioned despite presenting valid credentials on the first request, a case a different supervisor had reviewed and closed without watching the full footage attached to it. Isaiah's case wasn't an isolated failure. It was simply the clearest recorded example of a pattern that had existed for years, one that had been visible to supervisors long before that morning in the terminal. If anyone had ever thought to look at the complaints as a whole, instead of one at a time. Civilian footage of the incident spread quickly once it reached social media, then local news, then national coverage within days. The clip that circulated most widely was the one from Maya Richards' phone, capturing Isaiah's voice clearly in the instant before Vale forced him down. "I am complying." The Department of Defense issued a brief, measured statement acknowledging awareness of the incident and confirming cooperation with the appropriate civilian and military authorities. Nothing more dramatic than that. Isaiah declined most interview requests that followed. The few times he did speak publicly, his message stayed consistent and restrained. "This shouldn't have needed my job title to matter," he said in one brief statement. "The identification, the orders, the witnesses, all of it existed before anyone learned what I do for a living. That should have been enough on its own." Internal Affairs closed its preliminary review with a clear set of findings. No impersonation alert or bulletin had ever existed to justify the stop. Vale had lacked adequate objective grounds to detain Isaiah in the first place. Isaiah had complied throughout the entire encounter. The force used against him had been unnecessary. Vale's recorded language reflected racial bias. Vale's written report had materially misrepresented what actually happened. Danner had physically assisted the unlawful force, failed in his independent duty to intervene, and echoed the false account in his own report. Both officers were suspended without police authority for the remainder of the review. Their firearms, access cards, and database credentials formally revoked pending outcome. The state certification board opened its own formal proceeding shortly after. The full administrative process took several months to complete, methodically, through hearings and documented findings rather than a single dramatic announcement. Vale was ultimately terminated, the findings citing gross misconduct, excessive force, discriminatory conduct, dishonesty in his official report, and material misrepresentation of the facts. And following a formal hearing built entirely on those findings, his law enforcement certification was permanently revoked, closing the door on him ever holding a badge again in that state. Danner's case concluded in termination as well, tied specifically to his direct participation in the takedown and to the false account in his own report, alongside a certification suspension long enough to end his career in policing for the foreseeable future, with the possibility of a future hearing only if he met the board's conditions years down the line. Two supervisors who had reviewed and closed earlier complaints against Vale, without meaningful action, also faced consequences of their own, individualized to what each of them had actually done. The one who had approved the junior officer's reassignment request without ever asking why lost supervisory authority, and chose early retirement rather than continue in a diminished role. The other, who had closed the airport employee's complaint without watching the attached footage, was formally demoted with a permanent note placed in their file describing the failure. Not every officer in this story failed. Maria Sloan and Chief Mercer had both acted exactly as the badge required the moment the evidence was placed in front of them, without hesitation and without protecting their own, and investigators made a point of noting that distinction clearly in the final report. Following the findings, the Airport Police Department agreed to a formal reform process, accepting independent oversight of its use of force reviews going forward. Stops based only on an officer's stated instinct, with no written alert or objective description behind them, would now be automatically flagged for audit. Every officer would carry an explicit duty to intervene, with mandatory reporting requirements for anyone who witnessed excessive force. Complaints would be tracked in aggregate, not case by case, so a pattern like Vale's could never again sit invisible across a dozen separate files. Officers would receive updated training on verifying government and military credentials through the proper federal liaison channel, built specifically around one clear rule. Appearance is never a discrepancy, and a uniform is never, by itself, a reason for suspicion. Months later, a training bulletin distributed across the department used an anonymized still image from the body camera footage, without names, to illustrate exactly the kind of escalation the new policies were built to prevent. Isaiah, in the meantime, filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Vail, Danner, and the airport authority responsible for their conduct, built on the body camera footage, the surveillance recordings, the witness videos, his medical documentation, the radio traffic, his official orders, and the record of prior complaint supervisors had failed to act on. The case concluded in a formal settlement months later, one that acknowledged the department's failures directly. The dollar figure mattered far less, in the end, than the public record the case left behind. A record that could not be quietly revised or forgotten the way so many of Vail's earlier incidents nearly had been. Not long after the review closed, Isaiah sat across from Commander Jonathan Pierce, his command representative throughout the process, in a quiet office far from any airport terminal. "Your conduct throughout this was documented accurately, start to finish," Pierce said. "That mattered more than people realize. I wanted it preserved before anyone had the chance to redefine what compliance looked like," Isaiah said. "Once the tape existed, they couldn't rewrite it into something it wasn't." "For what it's worth," Pierce added, "restraint like yours shouldn't be the price of being believed. You shouldn't have needed to be perfectly calm for this to matter." "I know," Isaiah said quietly, "but I also know what happens to men who aren't given the benefit of the doubt on a bad day. I wasn't going to give them a single frame of footage they could twist." Several weeks later, Isaiah moved through another airport terminal, dress blues pressed, garment bag over his shoulder, official orders folded in his jacket pocket, alongside the memorial program he still hadn't taken out. He passed 2 officers stationed near the security checkpoint, and for a brief moment, some old current beneath his composure remembered exactly what Tell felt like against his cheek. Neither officer looked twice at him. He kept walking, toward his gate, toward the next briefing, the next deployment, the next ordinary morning that deserved to stay ordinary. The Pentagon hadn't destroyed anyone's career by picking up a phone. Careers were destroyed by choices that had already been made and recorded long before any federal office became involved. An unsupported stop, language that revealed exactly what Vail believed before he ever admitted it. Force used against a man who was already complying. A report that tried to describe stillness as resistance. A partner who saw it happening and said nothing. And supervisors who had been shown the same warning signs for years and chose again and again to look away. Military and federal attention hadn't invented any of that. It had simply made sure none of it could be buried quietly the way it always had been before. The evidence had done the rest. Should an officer be required to name an actual written alert or objective description before restraining someone on suspicion of impersonating a service member?